The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks of Belleau Wood like spectral fingers, masking what would become one of the most brutal and decisive battles in United States Marine Corps history. It was the first day of June 1918, and the Great War had already consumed Europe for nearly 4 years. Along the Marne River, 60 miles northeast of Paris, the German spring offensive had brought Kaiser Wilhelm's forces closer to the French capital than they had been since 1914. Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, crouched behind a hastily constructed earthwork near the village of Luchy-le-Bocage, studying the tree line through his field glasses. The wood stretched before them like a dark fortress, its canopy hiding machine gun nests and entrenched German positions that had been fortified over weeks of careful preparation. The French forces that had previously held this sector were in full retreat, their morale shattered by the relentless German advance. "Sir, the French colonel is advising immediate withdrawal," reported Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, his weathered face grim beneath his campaign hat. Daly was a legend among the Marines, holder of 2 Medals of Honor from previous campaigns in China and Haiti. His presence alone steadied the younger Marines who had never faced combat of this magnitude. Williams lowered his binoculars and turned to face the French officer who approached their position. The colonel's uniform was mud-stained, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much death. Through a hastily summoned interpreter, the Frenchman urged the Americans to fall back to more defensible positions. The Marine captain's response would echo through military history. "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." His words carried across the Marine lines, sparking grins on faces that moments before had shown uncertainty. The 2nd Division of the American Expeditionary Force, which included both Marines and Army units, had been rushed to this sector as emergency reinforcements. They were fresh troops, but they were also untested in the crucible of Western Front warfare. Major General Omar Bundy, commanding the 2nd Division, had received urgent orders from General Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, to hold the line at all costs. Paris lay vulnerable behind them, and the German 4th Army under General Sixt von Arnim had punched through French defenses with devastating effectiveness. The Marines of the 4th Brigade represented America's elite fighting force, but they were about to face the battle-hardened troops of the German 287th Reserve Infantry Regiment. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning fog, the true scope of their challenge became clear. Belleau Wood was roughly 1 mile long and half a mile wide, filled with massive boulders, thick undergrowth, and defensive positions that had been prepared with Germanic thoroughness. Machine gun teams had established interlocking fields of fire, while snipers had selected positions that commanded every approach. Lieutenant Colonel James Harbord, commanding the 4th Marine Brigade, moved among his units, conferring with company commanders and studying intelligence reports. The information was sparse, but troubling. German strength in the wood was estimated at over 1,000 men, supported by artillery positions to the rear. The Marines would have to attack across open ground before even reaching the wood's edge, making them vulnerable to the devastating fire of Maxim machine guns. According to historical accounts preserved in the National Archives, the tension among the American forces was palpable as they prepared for what many sensed would be a defining moment. The Marines had arrived in France with great fanfare, but critics questioned whether these American forces could match the battle-hardened veterans of the European War. The answer would come in the blood-soaked earth of Belleau Wood. The attack began at dawn on June 6, 1918, with artillery shells screaming overhead like banshees announcing death. The preliminary bombardment was intended to soften German positions, but the thick canopy of Belleau would absorb much of the explosive force, leaving many enemy machine gun nests intact and deadly. First Lieutenant Clifton Cates of the 96th Company led his Marines across the wheat field that separated them from the wood's eastern edge. The young officer from Tennessee had enlisted as a private and worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect through leadership and courage. Now, as German machine guns opened fire with their characteristic rapid chatter, he found himself leading men into what would later be called Hell's Acre. The Marines advanced in waves, using whatever cover the rolling terrain provided. Shell holes from previous bombardments became temporary refuges as Maxim guns swept the field with methodical precision. Private Carl Brannan, a Missouri farm boy serving with the 80th Company, pressed himself against the earth as bullets whined overhead. The sound was unlike anything in his experience, a deadly symphony of whipping steel that seemed to fill the air itself. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen, a veteran of the Boxer Rebellion, rallied a group of Marines who had taken cover in a depression near the wood's edge. At 56 years old, he was ancient by military standards. But his experience proved invaluable as he organized the scattered men for a final rush into the trees. "Come on, you sons of bitches," he shouted above the gunfire. "Do you want to live forever?" The phrase would become Marine Corps legend, though some attributed it to Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly in a similar moment of desperate inspiration. The German defenders were members of the elite Jäger units. Hunters and woodsmen who knew every tree and boulder in Belleau Wood. They had spent weeks preparing their positions, creating a maze of interconnected strongpoints that could provide mutual support. Each Marine advance was met with withering fire from multiple directions, forcing the Americans to fight for every yard of ground. Captain Donald Duncan of the 82nd Company found himself pinned down with a handful of Marines behind a cluster of massive boulders. German grenades exploded around their position while sniper fire picked off any man who showed himself. Duncan realized that conventional tactics would result in wholesale slaughter. The Marines needed to adapt to this new form of warfare or face annihilation. The fighting devolved into small unit actions as Marine squads infiltrated the wood using whatever cover they could find. Corporal Joseph Sisler led a fire team through a ravine that offered concealment from the main German positions. The Connecticut native had worked in his father's machine shop before the war, and his mechanical aptitude served him well as he disabled several German automatic weapons with grenades improvised from captured munitions. As referenced in official Marine Corps historical records compiled after the war, the first day's assault gained only a few hundred yards of ground at tremendous cost. Companies that had started the morning with full strength were reduced to scattered remnants. The Marines had learned harsh lessons about modern warfare, that courage alone was insufficient against well-prepared defensive positions equipped with rapid-fire weapons. By nightfall, the surviving Marines had established a tenuous foothold in the southern portion of the wood. They dug hasty fighting positions among the trees, while German artillery searched for their locations with harassing fire. Medical corpsmen worked through the darkness, evacuating wounded men across the deadly wheat field to aid stations in the rear. The German commanders, confident in their defensive superiority, began planning counterattacks to drive the Americans back across the open ground. They had faced British, French, and Canadian forces throughout the war, but these Marines displayed a ferocity that surprised even veteran German officers. The stage was set for 3 weeks of the most savage fighting the Western Front had witnessed since Verdun. The counterattack came at first light on June 7, 1918. As German stormtroopers emerged from concealed positions throughout, Belleau would like wolves materializing from morning mist. The Marines, exhausted from their previous day's assault and operating on minimal sleep, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives as the enemy sought to drive them back across the deadly wheat field. Sergeant Major John Quick, a veteran of the Spanish-American War and the Boxer Rebellion, coordinated the Marine defense from a shell crater that served as an improvised command post. The German assault was spearheaded by Lieutenant Hans Müller of the 2nd Company 100th 90th Infantry Regiment. The Bavarian officer had survived 3 years of trench warfare and understood that speed and violence of action were essential when attacking entrenched positions. His stormtroopers moved through Belleau Wood like deadly phantoms, using the thick undergrowth to approach Marine positions from unexpected directions. Private Henry Larson of the 79th Company found himself isolated. When the German attack split his squad, the Wisconsin dairy farmer turned Marine took refuge behind a fallen oak tree. As enemy soldiers moved past his position, when a German flamethrower team prepared to assault the Marine line, Larson made a desperate decision that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross. Rising from concealment, he charged the enemy position with fixed bayonet, killing 2 Germans and scattering the rest before falling mortally wounded. The Marines' salvation came in the form of artillery support coordinated by Captain Samuel Cumming, a forward observer who had established his post in the upper branches of a massive oak tree. Despite constant sniper fire and the chaos of close combat below, Cumming directed devastating barrages that broke up German formations before they could exploit their initial gains. His accurate fire control prevented what could have been a complete Marine collapse. Gunnery Sergeant Charles Hoffman led a counterattack that restored the Marine line, after German stormtroopers had penetrated nearly to the wood's edge. The Pennsylvania veteran gathered survivors from 3 different companies and launched a desperate assault that caught the Germans by surprise, with rifles, bayonets, and improvised weapons. The Marines slowly pushed the enemy back into the heart of Belleau Wood. The fighting was savage and personal, often conducted at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Corporal William Jackson of the 83rd Company engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a German sergeant among the roots of an ancient oak tree. Both men had exhausted their ammunition and fought with knives and bare hands until Jackson emerged victorious, though badly wounded. As documented in post-war interviews conducted by Marine Corps historians, the psychological toll of this intimate combat was devastating for men on both sides. Unlike the impersonal artillery duels that characterized much of Western Front warfare, Belleau Wood forced soldiers to look into their enemies' eyes as they killed or died. Many veterans would carry these memories for the rest of their lives. Medical Corpsman James Patterson crawled through the underbrush throughout the day, treating wounded Marines under constant fire. The former medical student from Philadelphia had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the Corps, and his courage under fire saved dozens of lives. German snipers had standing orders to target medics, making Patterson's work doubly perilous. By the evening of June 7th, both sides had fought themselves to exhaustion. The Germans retained control of most of Belleau Wood, but their counterattack had failed to dislodge the Marines from their foothold. The Americans had learned valuable lessons about forest warfare, and were beginning to adapt their tactics to the unique challenges of this battlefield. The woods fell silent except for the moans of wounded men and the distant rumble of artillery. Both armies prepared for the prolonged struggle they now realized lay ahead. Belleau Wood would not be taken in a day or even a week. It would require a sustained campaign that would test the Marine Corps fighting spirit as never before. The 3rd week of June, 1918, brought a fundamental shift in tactics as Marine commanders realized that conventional assault methods were proving too costly against the German defensive positions in Belleau Wood. Lieutenant Colonel James Harbord, commanding the 4th Marine Brigade, implemented new small unit tactics that would revolutionize American infantry warfare and earn the Marines a fearsome reputation among their enemies. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, now leading infiltration teams deep into enemy territory, had become a master of forest warfare. The diminutive Marine, standing barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, moved through Belleau Wood like a deadly ghost, gathering intelligence and disrupting German supply lines. His expertise in close-quarter combat, honed through years of fighting in exotic locations from Peking to Port-au-Prince, proved invaluable in the brutal environment of the wood. The Germans had begun referring to the Marines as Teufelhunden, or devil dogs, a nickname that reflected both respect and fear for their tenacious fighting spirit. Oberst Wilhelm von Einem, commanding the German forces in the sector, reported to his superiors that these American Marines displayed a fanatical disregard for casualties that borders on the supernatural. His assessment was based on numerous encounters, where Marines continued attacking despite devastating losses. Private First Class Jesse Widener of the 97th Company exemplified this fighting spirit during a night raid on German positions near the woods center. The Iowa farmhand led a patrol that penetrated deep into enemy territory, destroying a machine gun nest that had been causing heavy casualties during daylight hours. Widener's action required crawling through dense undergrowth for over 2 hours, while German patrols searched for American infiltrators. The Marines had adapted to fighting in what they called green hell, developing new techniques for forest combat that emphasized stealth, small unit coordination, and maximum use of available cover. Sergeant William Eddy, a former college professor turned Marine, trained his men in these new tactics using methods he had learned from studying Indian warfare during his academic research into American frontier history. Captain Alphonse Descartes of the 81st Company coordinated artillery strikes with unprecedented precision, often calling fire danger close to his own positions to break up German attacks. The French-Canadian officer had immigrated to America before the war and enlisted in the Marines to prove his loyalty to his adopted country. His skill and fire coordination saved numerous Marine positions from being overrun during desperate moments. According to documentation preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's military archives, the psychological warfare aspects of Belleau would become as important as the physical combat. German prisoners reported that Marine battle cries and aggressive tactics had severely damaged morale among defending units. The Americans seemed immune to the defensive advantages that had stymied Allied forces throughout the war. The fighting reached a crescendo on June 20th, when Major Maurice Cherier launched a coordinated assault against the northern section of Belleau Wood. The attack was supported by French artillery and featured the first large-scale use of Marine infiltration tactics. Companies advanced in small groups, using concealment and mutual support to penetrate German positions that had previously been considered impregnable. First Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard led the spearhead assault against Hill 242, the highest point in Belleau Wood and key to German defensive coordination. The Virginia Military Institute graduate had studied German defensive doctrine and realized that capturing this observation post would blind enemy artillery spotters. His company fought uphill through thick underbrush, while German machine guns swept their advance. Corporal Frank Waddell, a former circus performer from Texas, used his acrobatic skills to approach German positions from unexpected angles. The unusual background that had made him an oddity in peacetime proved invaluable in the three-dimensional battlefield of Belleau. Woodwall Dill's ability to climb trees and move through the canopy allowed him to attack machine gun nests from above, a tactic that German defenders had not anticipated. The Marines' growing expertise in forest warfare was complemented by improved coordination with French artillery and air support. Captain William Mitchell, commanding American air units in the sector, provided reconnaissance that identified German strongpoints and supply routes. This intelligence allowed Marine commanders to plan attacks that targeted enemy weak points rather than simply advancing against prepared positions. By June 21st, the Marines controlled approximately half of Belleau Wood, but the cost had been enormous. Entire companies had been reduced to squad strength, and veteran non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of Marine units had suffered disproportionate casualties. The Corps was learning that even elite infantry required time to master the complexities of modern warfare. The dawn of June 23, 1918 brought news that would galvanize the Marine Corps and capture the attention of the American public. Sergeant Merwin Silverthorne of the 6th Marines had led a reconnaissance patrol that discovered German preparations for a massive counteroffensive, designed to recapture all of Belleau Wood and push American forces back across the Marne River. The intelligence gathered by Silverthorne's patrol would prove crucial in preventing what could have been a catastrophic defeat. Major Thomas Holcomb, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, received orders to conduct a spoiling attack that would disrupt German preparations. The future commandant of the Marine Corps was only 35 years old, but had already demonstrated exceptional tactical skill during the battle. Holcomb's plan called for simultaneous assaults on multiple German positions to prevent enemy commanders from concentrating their defensive efforts. The attack was spearheaded by Captain Peter Conacher's 78th Company, reinforced by survivors from other units that had suffered heavy casualties during previous weeks of fighting. Conacher, a Scottish immigrant who had worked his way up from private, understood that success depended on speed and surprise rather than the methodical advances that had characterized earlier phases of the battle. Private Carl Brannan found himself part of a squad assigned to capture a German machine gun position that dominated the approaches to the northern edge of the wood. The Missouri farm boy had survived 3 weeks of combat that had claimed most of his original platoon, and his experiences had transformed him from an uncertain recruit into a seasoned veteran. Brannan's squad used smoke grenades to mask their advance, a tactic that proved highly effective against German defensive doctrine. The German resistance was fierce and well-coordinated, led by veteran officers who understood that losing Belleau would compromise their entire defensive line along the Marne. Hauptmann Friedrich von Lossberg, Prussian Guards officer, commanded the northern section of German defenses, and had prepared multiple fallback positions to channel American attacks into killing zones. Corporal Robert Yeatman of the 82nd Company demonstrated extraordinary heroism when his platoon was pinned down by crossfire from 2 machine gun positions. The former college athlete from Maryland made a series of rushes across open ground, drawing enemy fire while his comrades maneuvered to attack German positions from the flank. Yeatman's selfless actions allowed his unit to advance, though he was severely wounded in the process. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class John McGinty earned the Navy Cross for his actions during the June 23rd assault. The Irish-American medic from Boston had already distinguished himself during previous engagements. But his performance on this day was extraordinary, even by Marine Corps standards. McGinty treated over 30 wounded Marines under direct fire, often crawling into no man's land to reach casualties who could not be evacuated by conventional means. As referenced in official casualty reports filed with the War Department, Marine losses during the Belleau Wood campaign were approaching 50% of original strength. Companies that had arrived in France with full complements were reduced to reinforced squads, while battalion command structures were maintained only through constant promotion of surviving personnel. The psychological impact of these losses was severe. But Marine morale remained high due to the leadership provided by surviving officers and non-commissioned officers. Gunnery Sergeant John Overton, despite being wounded twice, continued to coordinate small unit actions with a tactical skill that impressed even German opponents. His ability to maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress exemplified the Marine Corps leadership tradition. The fighting on June 23 marked a turning point in the battle, as German resistance began to show signs of weakening. Prisoners reported declining morale and supply shortages that were beginning to affect combat effectiveness. The sustained pressure applied by Marine forces was achieving its intended effect, though at a cost that shocked American commanders unfamiliar with Western Front casualty rates. First Lieutenant Oscar Petrus led a night attack that penetrated to within 50 yards of the German command post in the center of Belleau Wood. The Arkansas native had been promoted from sergeant after his original company commander was killed, and his aggressive leadership style proved well suited to the desperate fighting that characterized the battle's final phase. Petrus's raid gathered valuable intelligence while disrupting German command and control. By the morning of June 24th, Marine forces controlled 3/4 of Belleau Wood, but German resistance remained fanatical in the remaining positions. The final phase of the battle would require every ounce of courage and tactical skill that the Marines could muster. As enemy forces prepared for a last-ditch defense of their remaining strongholds, the morning of June 25, 1918 dawned gray and overcast, with the acrid smell of cordite and death hanging heavy over Belleau Wood like a funeral shroud. Major Maurice Shearer, now commanding the remnants of multiple Marine battalions, prepared for what intelligence indicated would be the final German stand in the northern section of the wood. The enemy had concentrated their remaining forces around a cluster of machine gun positions that commanded the last approaches to their defensive line. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Stockham, despite being wounded earlier in the campaign, insisted on leading the final assault personally. The Philadelphia native had become legendary among the Marines for his tactical brilliance and personal courage under fire. Stockham's plan called for a coordinated attack using all the lessons learned during 3 weeks of brutal forest warfare. The assault would begin with concentrated artillery fire, followed by infiltration teams that would neutralize German strongpoints before the main force advanced. The preliminary bombardment began at 0600 hours, with French 75mm guns targeting known German positions throughout the northern wood. Captain Samuel Cumming, the forward observer who had survived multiple close calls during previous engagements, directed fire with the precision that had become his trademark. Each shell was carefully placed to maximize destruction while minimizing the risk to advancing Marine infantry. Private Louis Kukla, an immigrant from Austria-Hungary who had enlisted to prove his American loyalty, led the first infiltration team into the German positions. The former coal miner's knowledge of German language and customs proved invaluable as his team penetrated enemy lines undetected. Kukla's mission was to locate and neutralize a German artillery observation post that had been directing accurate fire against Marine positions. The main assault began at 0800 hours with 3 companies advancing simultaneously along different axes. First Lieutenant Clifton Cates, now commanding the 96th Company despite multiple wounds, led the central attack against the strongest German position. The Tennessee officer had become expert in the small unit tactics that proved most effective in forest warfare, and his men advanced with the confidence that came from hard-won experience. Corporal Carl Brannan found himself assigned to a flanking movement that would approach German positions from the east, where intelligence suggested the defensive line might be weaker. The Missouri veteran carried extra ammunition for his Browning automatic rifle, knowing that sustained fire would be crucial during the final assault. Brannan's squad included survivors from multiple units, forming the kind of improvised team that had become characteristic of Marine operations during the later stages of Belleau Wood. The German defense was commanded by Oberleutnant Hans Albrecht, a Bavarian officer who had volunteered to remain with the rearguard, while other units withdrew to new positions. Albrecht understood that his mission was to delay the American advance long enough for German forces to establish new defensive lines closer to the Marne River. The young officer had positioned his remaining men with the skill that characterized German defensive doctrine throughout the war. Hospital Corpsman Second-Class Robert Bush moved with the advancing Marines, prepared to treat casualties during what everyone expected would be the bloodiest fighting of the entire campaign. The Ohio native had already earned 2 decorations for heroism under fire, and his medical expertise had saved dozens of Marine lives. Bush carried extra morphine and bandages, knowing that the final assault would generate numerous casualties. The fighting reached its climax when Marines of the 78th Company encountered the main German defensive position among a cluster of massive boulders that provided natural fortification. Captain Peter Conacher led his men in a direct assault that required individual Marines to climb over and around the stone obstacles, while German machine guns swept the approaches with methodical fire. As documented in after-action reports preserved by the Marine Corps Historical Division, the final hour of fighting at Belleau would demonstrate both the evolution of Marine Corps tactical doctrine and the extraordinary personal courage of individual Marines. Men who had entered the battle as untested recruits fought with the skill and determination of veteran warriors, having learned their trade in the hardest school of all. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Stockham fell mortally wounded while personally leading the assault against the last German machine gun position. The Philadelphia Marines' final words, according to witnesses, were instructions to his men about flanking the enemy position. Stockham would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the Belleau Wood campaign, representing all the Marines who had given their lives in the dark wood. By 1400 hours on June 26th, organized German resistance in Belleau Wood had ended. The few surviving German soldiers either surrendered or retreated toward new defensive positions. Marine patrols began the grim task of clearing remaining enemy positions and counting the cost of their victory. The silence that descended over Belleau Wood on the afternoon of June 26, 1918, was more profound than anything the surviving Marines had experienced in 3 weeks of continuous combat. Captain James Harbord walked through the shattered forest, surveying the battlefield where his 4th Marine Brigade had earned immortality at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. First Lieutenant Clifton Cates, now commanding what remained of the 96th Company, sent the message that would become Marine Corps legend. Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. The simple words carried the weight of unprecedented sacrifice and marked the end of the Corps' bloodiest single engagement since its founding in 1775. Cates himself bore wounds from multiple engagements, but had refused evacuation until the battle was complete. The casualty reports painted a stark picture of the price paid for victory. The 4th Marine Brigade had suffered over 5,000 casualties, including over 1,000 killed in action. Companies that had arrived in France with full strength were reduced to mere squads, while veteran non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of Marine leadership had been decimated. The 6th Marines alone had lost over 60% of their original strength. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, one of the few senior enlisted Marines to survive the entire campaign, supervised the evacuation of wounded comrades, while German artillery continued to harass Marine positions with long-range fire. The veteran of China and Haiti had witnessed combat on 3 continents, but below it had tested even his iron constitution. Daly would later describe the battle as the hardest fighting I ever seen in 30 years of Marine Corps service. The German withdrawal from Belleau would mark the beginning of their general retreat from the Marne salient. As Kaiser Wilhelm's spring offensive finally lost momentum against stiffening Allied resistance, Oberst Wilhelm von Einem, the German commander who had faced the Marines throughout the campaign, would later write in his memoirs that American forces displayed a disregard for casualties that exceeded even our own stormtroopers. Medical personnel worked through the night of June 26, treating wounded Marines and evacuating casualties to field hospitals in the rear. Hospital Corpsman First Class David Porter, who had served with distinction throughout the campaign, coordinated medical evacuation despite being wounded himself. The former medical student's knowledge had saved countless lives during the battle's most desperate moments. French forces began moving through the captured wood on June 27th, officially relieving the Marines who had paid such a terrible price for victory. General Philippe, commanding French forces in the sector, issued a special commendation recognizing Marine Corps performance during the battle. The French general declared that American Marines had demonstrated fighting qualities equal to the finest troops in the French army. According to official records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, Belleau became the first foreign battlefield to be permanently associated with United States Marine Corps history. The French government would later rename the Forest Bois-de-la Brigade de Marine in honor of the American forces who had died there. This recognition established a tradition of international respect for Marine Corps' fighting ability that continues to the present day. The individual acts of heroism during Belleau Wood were so numerous that Marine Corps historians spent years documenting them all. Private Carl Brannan, who had survived the entire campaign, despite being wounded twice, would later write a memoir describing the transformation of American civilians into hardened warriors through the crucible of combat. His account provided one of the most detailed records of small unit actions during the battle. The strategic significance of Belleau would extended far beyond its immediate tactical importance. The Marines had proven that American forces could match and defeat German troops under conditions that favored the defense. This demonstration of American fighting capability had profound effects on both Allied morale and German strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The legend of Belleau would grow in subsequent decades, as Marine Corps tradition celebrated the courage and sacrifice displayed during those 3 weeks in June. 1918. The battle became a cornerstone of Marine Corps identity, representing the transformation of the Corps from a small colonial constabulary into America's premier fighting force. Every Marine who followed would measure himself against the standard established by the devil dogs of Belleau Wood. The quiet forest, scarred by shell fire and stained with blood, stood as eternal testimony to the price of victory and the birth of modern Marine Corps tradition. In the lengthening shadows of that June evening, the surviving Marines began their march into history, carrying with them the knowledge that they had participated in something far greater than a tactical victory. They had forged the legend that would inspire Marines for generations to come.